All right, hi guys. So since I won't be able to be there this week, I wanted to cover a presentation that I was going to go over in class. So I'm just going to go over it here, and it's a pretty quick one. Nothing too major, but I did just want to cover composition a little bit and how shapes can give us certain feelings, a certain way that we can view an image. It can evoke certain emotions. And the way that you can break those down into like their most basic shapes and use that to kind of guide the viewer wherever you want them to be in terms of looking at the picture and giving them, giving the appropriate emotional response or feeling a certain way about it. Because again, we're trying to convey an idea and we're trying to do it fairly efficiently. So there are some very basic shapes that will do exactly that. All right, so let's jump into the slideshow. Let me see here from beginning. Here we go. All right, so once that starts up, there we go. All right, first one right off the bat, horizontal shapes. They give us a sense of stability and calm. All right, now the easiest way to look at this is it gives us this sense because nothing's happening. It's just kind of sitting there. It's pretty stable. All right, so here we have a great example by an illustrator, Howard Pyle. I know I mentioned him when I was going over at the quick little history of illustration. And I did say that his paintings, whether you like them or not, they are pretty much a clinic in visual storytelling and visual narrative. And one of the greatest examples of that, especially when we're dealing with this particular shape, is this one, marooned. All right, we take a look at this. Nothing is happening in this particular image. We have no sea monster that's going to come up. The pirates are not going to come and rescue him or anything like that. In fact, they've left him behind. All right, so we look here and we see maybe like a hint of a wave here in the background. We see a flock of seagulls going off into the distance, but they're even flying away. And even then, those things are not important. The vast majority of this piece is horizontal and it's stable and it's calm. So it very much says marooned. You can see here a lot of different horizontal shapes all the way through. Now, you may notice that there are a few diagonal shapes. Obviously, his arms are going down, his legs are coming up. When you have an image, you're always going to have shapes that kind of go against the grain of what you're trying to achieve here. But take a look at the image and realize that like 97, 98% of this image is kind of following one shape, one pattern. And when it's following it to that much, that degree, when that much of an image is reinforcing one idea, you're usually going to be going with that one idea, or it better be pretty splashy to that last 2% better be pretty splashy to change that. And in this case, it's not. It's just his arms. He's just relaxed. So it definitely says marooned. All right, vertical shapes. They are more exciting and more active. All right, this works kind of with gravity. We as human beings, we exist against a gravity every single day. And gravity wants nothing more than to drag us to the ground and hold us there. That's kind of the tension that we're going against every day. It's obviously not a huge amount of tension, but it's there. So whenever we view vertical shapes, we get that sense of motion, that sense of tension a little bit with this, but it's not too extreme. So here we can see a few examples of that. We have the parrot animals and umbrellas await Noah. When you take a look at the piece like this by Peter de Sèvres, we see the boat in the background. We see these group of people. They're not going to move anywhere. Like, they're not leaving. They're waiting for the boat. They're just going to be standing there. But when you see the picture, like if that was an animation, you could almost see them shifting a little bit, kind of going from one foot to the other, just kind of waiting. I mean, the snakes are slowly making their way in. There isn't anything that's really, the boat isn't going to crash through the dock. There isn't anything that's really going to jump out. But again, there is a little bit of motion, a little bit of tension. So we're starting out very, very slow. But there's two different things that we're getting into. On the one side, we have stability. And on the other side, we have motion. And these are the two major points that we're going to bounce back and forth to varying degrees. So we started with absolutely calm, and now we're going with a little bit of action, and will increase as we go forward. Speaking of which, we have diagonal shapes. They imply motion, and they imply tension. All right, so those are two different ideas that it's implying. It can literally imply, something is moving across the page, something is going to be moving in a certain direction, or is in the process of moving. That gives you motion. It can also imply tension, and we'll see two different versions. All right, so here we have a lot of diagonal shapes. We get a certain sense from this image that they're not in free fall. These guys are not like falling directly down or anything like that. They're staying aloft. It's a very kind of happy picture. This happy adventure through the clouds. but we get that sense of motion with the whole thing. We don't get that they're just kind of hanging out there and floating with one cloud. Like, they are flying, and the diagonal shapes definitely, definitely help us with that. We see this a lot in movies and in video games. This particular kind of composition is very, very popular these days. You know, it's very dynamic. It has a lot of motion to it. So we see here in the tour concept art, BioShock Infinite, you'll see this kind of composition in a lot of different places because it's one of those things where one of the easiest tricks you have, if your composition isn't as exciting as it needs to be, let's say that you've drawn a fight scene or something, and the ground underneath them is a perfectly horizontal line. Maybe take the whole sketch and just kind of tilt it one way or the other and see what happens. That usually adds a little bit of tension and motion to your piece. So, and in terms of tension, like I said, there's a difference between tension and motion. If you want to add tension, again, you can put them on an angle. You've seen this in like every movie you've ever watched. All right, so if you've seen Inception, it could have something that's pretty high action here. We have the zero-G fight scene where they're just kind of bouncing off the walls and the ceiling and moving their way around. So there's a lot of motion in that one. There is a lot of tension as well. And then on the flip side, we have The Dark Knight Rises. This is a scene where Bane is just having a conversation with Batman. They are just talking, and that's it. But it is a very ominous conversation. So in order to make it feel a little bit more tense, a little bit more ominous, especially since we can't see Bane's mouth moving, Christopher Nolan puts it on the diagonal, and it gives that little extra bit of tension to something like that. This is also called Dutch angles. So if you want to Google Dutch angles, you will get a lot of movie examples of exactly this kind of principle. And then finally, this is a piece that I did, that I put together, a painting of mine. And I remember when I was first putting together the sketch, just to kind of reinforce the idea of this is one of the best tricks that you have in your toolbox, when I first did the sketch, I kind of showed the car here sliding across the ground, but the ground was on pretty much a horizontal, and it just wasn't quite there yet. You know, it was like it needed one last little tweak to get it to where it needed to be just before I painted it. So I did exactly that, just turned it a little, put it on the diagonal, and suddenly I felt like it worked a little bit better. All right, a horizontal bar across a row of verticals, it brings stability. All right, so think of, you know, here we have kind of a silhouette of like Roman architecture, aqueducts, the Colosseum, anything like that. Anytime we've talked about like these basic shapes, I've had students in the past tell me it reminds them of a table or a dock, you know, a bridge even, things that really kind of stand stable. And that's the way to wrap your head around this. If you can think of images of actual objects, you know, when you're thinking about tables and things like that, you know they're not going to fall over. You know that there's a certain amount of stability to something like this. So exactly with your illustrations, you can do exactly the same thing. And here we have some great examples of that. All right, the Curious Garden, which includes the High Line from New York City, the rail line where they've built kind of a walk-through garden experience. Almost any given Ernst Shepard illustration from Winnie the Pooh will follow along these same exact lines, as long as it's not a blustery day or they're floating downstream in honey pots or anything like that. But for the most part, especially since the 100-acre wood is supposed to be a little bit more calm, a little bit more stable, you know, we know that the worst that's going to pop up are heffalumps and woozles, and they're not all that bad. So, yeah, it just overall gives a nice sense of stability to an image no matter what's happening. So it's a pretty easy way to go. One of the greatest examples of this is one book that I'm sure everybody has read or at least knows of, and that's Where the Wild Things Are. All right, so you take a look at this, you take a look at the cover. Now picture, you know, since I know everybody has pretty much read this book, picture that you've never read this book. And that somebody comes to you and they say, oh my God, there's this new book out, you know, by Maurice Sendak. It's an amazing one. It's called Where the Wild Things Are. And you ask about it and you say, oh, what's in it? And they say, monsters. Okay, great. What else? Oh, this kid runs away. You're not painting a great picture for this story so far. There's some creepy elements to this. And they're like, no, it's not a creepy story at all. This exact same thing happened when Maurice Sendak and the publishers needed to put together a book cover. So they needed to kind of give you an idea of what the story entails. So that, you know, when you say where the wild things are, you don't necessarily let your mind go in too many directions. And you can have a story that has a monster, that has fangs, that has claws, and still have a good sense of stability, because overall this book cover has a lot of stability all the way through. So again, it helps to reinforce the story. It helps people to understand when they open it up what they're kind of getting into. It's a primer for what you're going to see when you open up the book. All right, so if we take away that horizontal bar and now we just have verticals and diagonals, the diagonals are suddenly under great tension. All right. This one's a great example. This one comes from Marie Grand Pré. That's probably one of at least a few Harry Potter pieces I'll have throughout this presentation. Um, this one's a great one because it does give a great amount of tension. If you've never read the books or never seen the movie, you can still understand what might be going on in this scene. It's dark. It's ominous. There is a little bit of kind of a creepy factor with this albino peacock here. Overall, there are a lot of verticals and a lot of diagonals, all right? And the gate itself serves wonderfully to kind of lead us all the way through the image. You get the verticals and diagonals within the peacock itself. Another great thing to remember is that we look for faces. Anytime a viewer is looking at an image, they are looking for faces. They are looking for human faces first, then they'll look for animal faces. And if they can't find either one of those, they'll look for faces in rocks and trees and stuff like that. And then if it's like a landscape painting and it doesn't have any kind of magical creature coming out of the trees, we will then move on and look for other things, areas of contrast, value contrast, patterns, different things like that. Certain things that will attract your attention. But one of the easiest ways to attract attention in the first place is a face. All right, so we see all of these diagonals and all of these verticals. And in fact, there is another diagonal that's helping to reinforce this image. And that is the gaze that we have when we look back and forth between the two faces. All right, so we see the human faces down here, we see the peacock face up here, and while we look around the image, these are kind of the two places that our attention is drawn to the most. And so when we look back and forth, we are creating yet another diagonal that helps to reinforce the image and reinforce the tension within that image. All right, hills, slides, waves, mountains. These are all shapes in motion, all right? And now this applies not necessarily, we already talked a little bit earlier about diagonals and putting diagonals into an image. This deals a little bit more with putting diagonals in and like cutting an image across, just like a mountain range. You can see this with a literal mountain range, all right? So this is one of those ones where if you can picture the Gregory Manchess piece down at the bottom here with the polar bears, if you picture that on the horizontal as opposed to the diagonal, you don't get a sense of the struggle, the uphill climb. And in fact, then the explorer is about to faceplant, and the bears are laughing at him, and so is the owl, but the owl's a jerk, and he's about to faceplant too. So it doesn't really matter. But we also have up here this dragon in flight. Now, we don't see anything off of the image, so there is always a chance that, like, this dragon has some really long legs and is kind of hanging out on the top of a mountain. But because of the fact that the dragon cuts right down the middle, it gives us a really nice sense of motion, so we understand, and it's implied. And then you look at other things. You see the cape kind of billowing off to the side. There's all these things that reinforce that this is a dragon and a rider in motion. All right, so it's not necessarily just kind of sitting perched and looking out over things. It is definitely flying. It is definitely moving. Can also give you a nice sense of timing. All right, so this is a really old school reference, but if nobody's ever heard of Little Nemo in Slumberland, I think I brought it up the last time. You guys can absolutely take a look at that. Actually, I believe I did bring it up in the history of illustration, and I also showed you the Little Nemo piece in the library, so you can absolutely go and take a look at these. But I love this piece because, again, the idea of the story is he goes to sleep every week, wakes up in dreamland, in slumberland, and goes on his adventures. So number one, the story is reinforced there with that formula each week. And then we look at the image itself and we see the bed kind of cuts across with that exact same shape. And now what this does is it allows us to have a sense of timing. We look at this image and we have this clown character saying, Master Nemo, I come to ask you to go to Slumberland, and the princess is crying for you. All right, knowing everything we know about the formula, seeing the way that Nemo is poised, there is nothing about this image that says that Nemo is going to go back to sleep. That he's just going to say, I hear you, and that sounds like fun, but I need to get my 8 hours. I really need my beauty sleep. I've had a long day. I'm tired. That's not going to happen. He's going to get off the bed, and he's going to continue on the adventure. And the way that the composition is set up, he literally can't go back to bed. If he goes back to bed, climbs under the covers, he's going to slide down to the bottom of the bed, and the clown is still going to be staring at him, and it's going to be awkward for everybody. All right, so it's better for him just to go on the adventure. So what happens here is that if you're doing a sequential piece, or you have a children's book where you have another page and you're flipping the page, you don't have to show Nemo jumping off the bed in the next panel or in the next image. We already know that he's going to do that. So now your next image could be like Nemo running down down a cavern, or it could be them finding the castle or something. You can jump ahead now, so it gives a nice sense of timing. All right, a triangle placed on a flat base, it gives that base a feeling of stability. All right, so just like I mentioned before with the horizontal and the verticals together kind of creating that sense of stability and looking like Roman architecture or a table or anything like that, you can picture this in your mind just like the real world objects. The pyramids are a great example of that. They've been sitting there perfectly level for thousands of years. All right, so they're not moving anywhere. There's a great sense of stability with those things. You can do the same thing with your images. All right, back to Harry Potter because my nerdiness knows no bounds. This particular image, again, I will give no spoilers in case you haven't seen the movies or read the books, but they've been out for a very long time, so do it! Read them, they're great. When we look at this image, we see that there is a lot of motion in it. There is a lot of tension, especially with the light source and everything like that. So when I say we want to add some stability to a piece, why do you think Marie Grandpré took an image that has so much motion and so much tension in it and put it on a triangle, gave it like a nice pyramid shape? And the reason for that is there is so much information to take in, all right? So we're supposed to be looking at the shadow, at the figure, at the fact that the wands are being, taken away. We're supposed to notice the fact that Ron is lying on the floor. We're supposed to notice the fact that Crookshanks is kind of arching her back at them. There's so much to look at. So Marie Grandpré wants you to stop a minute and take a look through. So while there is a certain amount of tension here, a certain amount of motion, it's one of those images where there's a lot of information that you have to process visually. So she wants you to take like the extra 20 seconds or so to take a look at the image. So by giving you that stability, she's not allowing you to kind of spill out of the image. Your gaze isn't allowed to kind of spill out to the right or anything like that. You are kind of forced to sit there for an extra few seconds and give it the proper attention before moving on with the story. A triangle placed on a diagonal, it gives a nice sense of movement. All right, so this one's pretty easy. We take that same diagonal, that same triangle, and we put it on the diagonal, and suddenly it looks like it's going to slam down at any given point. All right, we'll go really old school with this one, and we'll go with a piece from the Rococo period. This one's called The Swing, and especially since, you're working with a landscape, you're working with things where there isn't a lot of, like, wind through the trees or birds all over the place, but the artist still wanted a great sense of movement with a piece like this, the shoe being kicked off. When you look at the actual swing itself, everything is kind of on a triangle. And if you wanted to, you can print this picture out, take like a red Sharpie, and just start building triangles. There's another triangle up here. This guy down here is a triangle. This guy back here can be considered a triangle. All the statues are triangles. The trees are coming at diagonals. You could go through and like find 1,000 different triangles all throughout this piece, and it all implies a great sense of motion. And so if anybody has seen this particular movie, the next movie that I'm going to show, that's why they ripped off this piece and they put it into Frozen. It's because, especially during this particular musical sequence for the first time in forever, which was my favorite song from the movie, but it worked out really nicely because the whole thing is kind of Anna on like a hyperactive tear through the castle, and there's a great sense of movement to it. So especially having her kick her foot up like this, you wanted that sense of movement. All right, yet another version here. We had Anna kind of hyperactively running through the castle, but now we have a quieter moment. Now we have a slower moment. And if you've seen How to Train Your Dragon, you understand what's coming next. And even if you haven't, take a look at the image and think about it. There's nothing about this that says that Toothless and Hiccup are going to get this close, that they are going to come this close to bonding, and then not do it, and bounce off each other, go their separate ways. And that'll be that. The credits roll, the story's over. It was a terrible story. It's over in like 15 minutes. No, everything about this image tells us that they're going to come together. You have these two triangles pointing directly at each other. They are going to come together. His hand's going to go on Toothless's forehead, and they are going to bond, and then they're off on their adventures, and their lives are changed. So everything about this composition implies that that's what's going to happen. All right, so in terms of having triangles, in terms of having things based in stability, there's also another thing that I want to get into, and that's centering your attention versus having your attention be somewhere else within the image. So if we put something in the direct center of your canvas, we're going to pay attention to it. This one's an easy one. You know, absolutely nothing else is happening here. We are focusing on the character. We see this a lot in portrait painting. You know, a lot of the focus goes on the face. And again, we view faces, we notice faces. So we take a look and we notice Theodore Roosevelt. All right, Wes Anderson has been making a career out of this. All right, that's what he does. A lot of centrally focused compositions. So what happens if we put in a lot of other characters and we suddenly vie for attention? You know, we have a lot of people who are ready to upstage your main area of focus. All right, now you're going to have to do a little bit more. All right, you don't remember which one was the character you're supposed to be looking at. If you showed this image to a bunch of people, they may all focus on different people in the first place. If you want them to focus on the character that you intend them to focus on, you have to do a little bit more. All right, so you're going to have to direct your viewer just a bit. All right, in some cases, you can frame it. All right, so we can put the character off to the side like this and have this little bit of space act as a frame. And by separating the character out, you bring back some focus to that particular character. You can also use lines. All right, so here we have Theodore Roosevelt again in a very different scenario. All right, take a look how all of the lines bring you back to one specific area of focus. Everything in this image is drawing you back. All right, so we have his posture. He's acting as kind of his own frame. The flag itself, you know, has a nice pattern behind the head that we notice him with. The branches are coming down and leading directly to him. Sasquatch is running directly towards him. His arm is pointing in that direction. The bullets are coming back towards him. Everything in this image kind of points you back at Theodore Roosevelt. All right, so that's what I mean by you have to refocus your attention. It's also called spoke wheeling. So you can picture it like an old wagon wheel where you have the hub in the center and then all the lines coming out from the hub. Basically, your center of attention is the hub. You start to bring all of the lines back in. So we have the sash on the window. We have the trim on the window, bringing us down into here. We have the shadow, bringing us up and over here. We have the paper airplane itself pointing as like one giant arrow to the character. So what happens when it's not that easy, though? That one was pretty easy. It was like literally a giant paper arrow pointing at the character. What happens when we have a lot of lines and a lot of things that vie for our attention? All right, so this is a great example. This is Triple Self-Portrait by Norman Rockwell. And it's actually, you know, I said we focus on faces. There are so many faces in here. We have the Triple Self-Portrait. We have his sketches up here. We have a face on the eagle. We have all the artists that he's influenced by up here. But yet, where he wants you to focus your attention is not on any of this stuff, but on the face in the mirror. And when you look at the image overall, you'll notice that everything is reinforcing that. We have all of these lines kind of directing us right back at the face. The eagle is looking down at him. The legs of the chair, they move their way up towards the mirror. The shapes of the face, even though the gaze is looking at us, the line across the eyes, the line across the hairline, the pipe itself, everything kind of points towards the face. Now, when you get ones that aren't doing that, like the stool leads up to his butt, which leads up to his back, which then leads to this. The maul stick comes down like this, connects with the arm, goes over. The arm itself comes down, goes over. So basically, all the lines are either pointing at the area of focus or connecting to something that's pointing at the area of focus. And again, this is one of those things that's just like that first thing I told you with the horizontal piece, when like 95% of an image tells you one thing and then a couple other things, like wadded up pieces of paper or something like that, point in a different direction. Odds are the wadded up pieces of paper aren't really trying to tell you something. That, you know, this is where your focus is. All right, the upper half of the picture. It's a place of freedom, happiness, triumph. Objects placed in the top half, they often feel more spiritual. So you can put this up here, and suddenly it's elevated. It's like the sun, it's clouds, it's space. It automatically feels a little bit more spiritual. All right, this is one of my favorite illustrations by an artist called named Chris Rashka. And this is a book that he did about jazz, basically. It's an illustration kind of trying to illustrate the idea of jazz, and especially with jazz, it's a music form that flows through the artist, and it's very improvisational. So the artist is feeling the music, and you wanted to give it that spiritual aspect. So picture that, you know, Thelonious Monk here is on the ground. If we put it down at the bottom, it's a guy who's having a seizure or doing the worm, or, you know, is just really kind of a puddle down at the bottom. It doesn't give you that spiritual aspect. Suddenly you have him up top. He's floating above everything with his piano. There's a dreamlike sequence to it. There's a spirituality to this. You'll see the exact same thing with skylines, with you know, wide open sky, with clouds, stars, everything like that. Anything that's put up in the upper section is kind of given this awesome quality. All right, on the flip side, the bottom half of a picture feels more threatened, heavier, sadder, or constrained. Objects in the bottom half also feel more grounded. All right, so this is one of those things where that's a lot of stuff for one image to feel. And odds are it doesn't feel all of those things. So it's almost like pick one of them. It'll feel grounded. It'll feel sadder. It'll feel threatened. It can feel a couple of these things. Doesn't necessarily mean it automatically feels all of these things. So, like, let's look at sadder. This piece doesn't say sad to me. All right, so again, knowing what we know about Harry Potter, we know that Hagrid is a giant. And he's a giant fit into this little tiny boat with all the first years making their way to Hogwarts. But by utilizing this composition, she's grounding Hagrid. Hagrid is this giant creature who kind of towers above everybody else. But now, putting him in this boat and putting him in the bottom half of the picture, he's in the same boat as us. Pun intended. That was a terrible pun. I should never make jokes like that. But he's on the same plane as us. You know, he is still just another mortal looking up in awe at the spectacle that is Hogwarts. So Hogwarts becomes like this big spiritual piece across the sky, and suddenly Hagrid, this giant of a man, is grounded against it. You also see this with Zelda. All right, so Link there is on his quest, and that's a big dark forest all around him. It seems a little heavy, you know, so anything could pop out at any time. Or he could continue on his journey. He has Navi along to bug him the whole time. And we've got the light streaming through and all of that. So this could be a very magical place. There could be danger around the corner. It feels a little bit heavier on something like this, but we don't entirely know yet. Or to finish out the video game references, we could still go with Bioshock. All right, I love this piece because it almost looks like we're walking down the stairs. All right, we see the top of the gas lights over here. We see that it goes down to another set of stairs here, and then there's the awesome that is Columbia up above us, you know, the floating cities and all the huge statues and stuff. It's grounding us within the image. It almost looks like we are walking out into Columbia, and they are, you know, Columbia is welcoming us. So it grounds us against everything. All right, and curved shapes. All right, so now we'll get into like actual basic shapes. And the ones that I want to bounce between are curved shapes versus pointed shapes. All right, so curved shapes in the first place, they embrace and protect. Makes it easy, all right? Nothing about this tells you that Mario's in any danger, all right? Even if he falls down, if he trips and falls down, he's just going to kind of roll up and then roll back down into this little pocket. There's nothing that's really going to happen. We don't worry that a giant bullet is going to come slamming across from the right or anything like that. No Goombas are in this. Everything about this kind of shows that he's being embraced and protected. And Mario himself is a fairly round character. There's nothing ominous about him. All round shapes. The mustache is round. You know, the hat is round. Even, you know, his body himself, he's a little pudgy. So everything about him kind of shows him as a protector. On the flip side, pointed shapes are more frightening. All right? We're working with basic human emotions here. You know, this is how most people view it. And again, this is a very important distinction to make. We can never make judgments as to what all 7 billion people on Earth how they will interpret something. All right, so you may show pointed shapes to all 7 billion people, and somebody might find it comforting. Somebody might like it a little bit more than curved shapes. All right. But what we're doing here is we're playing the odds, all right? So we're playing the odds that most people will recognize it in a certain way, especially when you're dealing with different cultures. And again, I'm kind of going at it from the Western American culture. You know, when we look at curved shapes, we are going to embrace them. When we look at pointed shapes, they're going to be a little bit more frightening. When you get into color usage, obviously, the cultural differences really become increased. But especially when we're working with shapes, we can play the odds pretty well. So pointed shapes are more frightening. And this is a great example of that. All right, if you've ever seen The Lord of the Rings, I love this example, the Shire. It is nothing but curved shapes. It is round hobbits living in round hills, inside round holes with round doors and round windows. You know, great full round trees. Every time we ever see it in the movies, it's never winter. It's always wonderful and warm and round and delightful. They have bacon with like every meal, and then they have like 17 meals. Why would you ever want to leave? It's warm, it's welcoming. And in fact, when we look at an image like this, in terms of visual storytelling, the only thing that is prominent and pointy is the one guy trying to take you all away from it. All right, so that's Gandalf sitting there in the middle with his pointed hat, and he's like, "Oh, I know you like this place, but come, let's go see some dragons. But it's totally cool. People might die, but it's okay. Let's go." Um, no, everything about this image says like stay here, and Bilbo and Frodo are both pretty much considered crazy by the other hobbits for even leaving. On the flip side, we have the vacation land that is Mordor. All right, everything about this screams pain and uncomfortableness and death and destruction and just darkness and evil. All right, so and that's a lot to do with the pointed shapes. The wraiths are all pointed shapes. The orcs are all pointed shapes, and the mountains. Everything about this Mountain Doom, it's all pointed shapes. All right, and so whereas with the Shire, we see the shots of people like who live there and love to be there and everything like that. Every time we see Mordor, there are like groups of orcs just streaming out of there. They can't wait to get out of there. They're like, no, let's go somewhere else. So everything about this kind of reinforces that uncomfortable aspect. Now, this doesn't mean that you can't have characters or situations that kind of go against each other. Curved shapes won't always embrace and protect. We have the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man. We have Adipose. We have Dolores Umbridge. All of these things are kind of rounded characters that, Umbridge, for God's sakes, has kitten plates and everything's pink by all rights. By what we've been going by, she should be a good character, but she's not, all right? And what this proves is that if you are going to use these shapes in this way, you need to do more, all right? You need to make it a little bit darker. You need to have more of a story. So in this case, we have entire movies to develop these characters, or entire scenes, or entire shows, or entire books, more than one image. If you are working with just one image, it becomes a lot trickier, right? Because again, you're trying to imply something to your viewer. So if you have just one image to show us that, and again, take away the cultural touchstone. Everybody recognizes the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man now and knows what happened. But if it hadn't happened and you just thought of it and you were like, oh, I'm going to have this giant marshmallow man attack New York City, you're going to have to do a little bit more to make that character ominous. Make the expression angry, add a lot of darkness to it, work with colors. You're going to have to do other stuff. But if you're working with just the basic compositional shape, sometimes that's not going to be enough. And on the flip side, you can have the other end be true as well. You can have these kind of spindly, pointy characters be noble, be heroic. All right, Jack Skellington. All right, he's a skeleton that stole Christmas. That's like the most evil thing you can do, and he's the hero. He's the guy that we look up to. All right, he learns his lesson and he fixes everything. But he is literally like points and sharp angles. Daryl from The Walking Dead looks like he just slept in a dumpster and probably smells like he just slept in a dumpster. And everything about him is points. His hair, his face, he carries a crossbow. All right, all of these things are points. But because we have the added benefit of being able to tell his story, you're able to do more to work with that character. And when I think of characters that are pointy and yet are still coming across as noble, there's one that really pops out every single time, and that is Wolverine. All right. His costume is pointed shapes. He has these claws come out of him. He's always in pain. He's always on fire. Something is always happening, okay? And yet, again, we know, because we have the added benefit of the extra story of the movies, of the comics, everything like that, that he is a noble soul, that he has kind of a noble heart. But again, if you're just creating this character in the first place, and you have one shot, maybe pointed shapes might not tell the whole story. You need other stuff. So keep that in mind as you're putting together your images. And that pretty much sums it up. Again, there's a lot more that we'll go into, but I think that's a good place to start for now. And I'll stop rambling before your eyes glaze over, and we'll jump into the assignment. All right.